Some of you are aware, some of you are new to us and aren't aware of this, but we used to do a third service here on Sunday afternoon. And pretty much the message that they got was the same one you got, only maybe in a different language than what I give it to you. But that was the only comparison to these services. The music was different, the praying was different, the presentation was different. It just was different. Is that some of them from that? Okay. And I got to tell you, I was okay with all of that. Some of you stopped in and checked it out, and maybe you weren't okay with it. I don't know. Some of you voiced your concerns, others didn't. But there was one thing that made me really uncomfortable. To preach, because I would change, to preach in blue jeans, tennis shoes with my shirt hanging out, took me way outside my comfort zone. Of all the stupid things that you could think of to throw me off balance, that was it. But when you understand my history, you kind of understand why that would throw me off. Because for 29 years, I did a whole different job than this one. Yep. And from the earliest days of that job, it is beat into your head that a clean and presentable uniform commands respect. And I didn't go to work unless that uniform was clean and presentable. My brass was polished, my gig line, any of you know what a gig line is? That's when your shirt and your zipper and your belt buckle all line up. Believe it or not. Used to take my badge, and I kept a tube of Colgate toothpaste and a toothbrush in my locker. That's how I clean those badges. My shoes got shined every day before I went on duty. You ever see cops standing around doing this on the back of their pant leg? You know what they're doing? They're shining their shoes. They're keeping them shined up and buffed. Julie never in 29 years touched my uniform because I knew she couldn't do it to suit me, that she wouldn't iron the creases sharp enough, that she wouldn't be able to put the buttons on straight. She couldn't sew a patch that it was exactly 2 inches below the shoulder seam and centered. So it wasn't worth the divorce. I paid the dry cleaner. Julie would also tell you that when I was in that uniform, she wasn't allowed to hold my hand. She wasn't allowed to kiss me goodbye. She was allowed to do absolutely nothing that could bring disrespect to my profession or that uniform. Now, Julie's a smart woman. One time she wrecked the car, found out that I was walking the beat downtown, came up and whispered in my ear what she had done, and then turned around and left because she knew that I couldn't react. Smart woman. Smart woman. And I'm kind of ashamed to say it, but that became almost sacred. My profession, the way I represented it, the way I wanted respect, and the way I treated my uniform became sacred. And I got to thinking, as I sometimes do I treat God the same way? Do I hold God as sacred as I did that uniform? And unfortunately, I have to admit, not always. You all have things in your life, do you not? That maybe you treat more sacred than God? A spouse, a grandparent, a child, a house, a car. Oh, and dare I say, a sports team? Sometimes we treat those kind of everyday things more sacred than we do God. The part of the prayer that we're going to look at today, hallowed be thy name, means just that. Hallowed means to hold something sacred. So the question you have to ask yourself, do you hold God sacred? Do you hold God in respect? Do you hold God in awe? Does God come before everything else in your lives? I can't answer it for you. You have to answer it. I can tell you biblically you're supposed to. Right? Every place in there I see that. Just the thing that Janice just read you a minute ago from Revelation, right? They're all bowing down in front of the throne. The angels and the 24 elders says, "You are worthy, O Lord, our God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things. And they exist because you created what you pleased." Is that not reverence? It's not holy? If not, I can go back up to where it starts out. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. At the end of the service, you're going to sing, "Holy, holy, holy." When I went to my church before this one, they shared with me that they had sang that song every Sunday for like 20 years. They thought that might be the only song that the organist knew. But it kind of sets the tone, doesn't it? Isn't that how we're supposed to be? There's a particular story in here that, to me, just resonates. It tells me how I'm supposed to treat God. You know, the story of Moses has always been embedded in the life of the Jewish nation and in ours. If you look at the stories, and every time that they started to talk about God, they said, you know, the God of your forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You know, the one that brought you out of slavery in Egypt. You know, the one that parted the Red Sea, etc., etc., etc. Even in the New Testament, when you look at some of the sermons of Peter and Paul, they do the same thing. When they're speaking to a Jewish audience, they go all the way back to Moses and then bring them forward to Jesus. They tell them their history, and then they lay on the gospel. You have to know these stories to understand the gospel. The Old Testament is there for a reason. But this morning, as we're talking about hallowed be your name, let's go to chapter 3, and you'll recognize it. One day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. "This is amazing," Moses said to himself. "Why isn't that bush, burning up? I must go see it." When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, "Moses, Moses!" "Here I am," Moses replied. "Do not come any closer. The Lord warned, take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." When Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. 6 verses, and I see how I'm supposed to treat God. 6 verses. Moses, if you remember the story before this, had killed an Egyptian, had fled Egypt, had ended up in the middle of the Middle East and met a man named Jethro because his daughters gave him water at a well. Matter of fact, he ended up marrying the oldest sister. Now he's got a pretty neat job, right? You just take Jethro's sheep out, find you a rock to lean against, and pretty soon your wife will bring you lunch, and in the meantime you can just admire the scenery. That's how you guys do it on the farm, isn't it? Okay. Just sit back and admire the scenery. But on this day, as he gets close to what was known as the mountain of God, Mount Sinai, he looks up and there is a bush on the side of the mountain that's burning. Now, I don't know all that much about the Middle East. I do know that it's dry. And I'm guessing when tumbleweed gets to burning, it goes pretty fast. This bush doesn't burn up. This bush doesn't dissolve. This bush doesn't go away. It keeps burning. Moses says, I got to go check this out. And as he gets close to the bush, he hears God, Moses, Moses, you are standing on holy ground. Take off your sandals. And does Moses not show reverence as he buries his face in his hands because he doesn't even want to look at God's face? God called him. God called him. And his attitude changed, didn't it? I want you to look around. You know you're in holy ground? But sometimes we get mixed up. You're not on holy ground because of stained glass. You're not on holy ground because there's a preacher here or a choir director or a Bible. You're on holy ground because we believe, and I know for a fact, that God's holy presence is here. I can just about tell you on a Sunday morning when the Holy Spirit shows up, because I can feel him. That's why this ground is holy. Moses, Moses, come here. That's all he had to say. That's all he had to say. And Moses obeyed. You know, sometimes we get hung up on reading fancy books or watching, not telemarketers, televangelists. And they kind of give you this thing that you can treat God like another person. Wrong. God is not your buddy. God is not your pal. God is your God. God is above you. God is not on the same level as you are. God demands more respect than you'll ever deserve. God made everything you see, everything you know. God gave you life. He's not your buddy. He's God. We should treat him with some reverence, should we not? Sometimes I think we cheapen God. Just like I have preached to you before, I think we cheapen the cross every once in a while. I think we cheapen God too. We want God to be on our level because, then we don't have to obey those other 10 things. It's not what it says. Moses buried his hands in. And I like to think he fell to his knees too. I know I couldn't take my sandals off if I didn't at least sit down in the dirt. And you have to understand, that says respect. That culture in that day and age, when you walked into somebody's house, you took your sandals off. It was a show of respect to the household and the people who lived there. So you're actually getting a message about respecting God too. But then to me, the sacredness of God goes on down as we skip through where Moses argues, I can't do this, and here's why, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We get down to verse 13. But Moses protested, if I go to the people of Israel and tell them the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they will ask me, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? God replied to Moses, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my eternal name, my name to remember for all generations. Sometimes we give God other names. because that makes him more on our level. God says, all you got to do is tell him, I got one name. One name. And by the way, this is the New Living Translation, but that is a literal translation of I am who I am. In other words, I always was, always will be, and I'm going to take care of you always. I am who I am. I was there at the beginning, I'll be there at the end and beyond. I am who I am. I am God. Everything you see was made by me. You were made by me. I am. Just tell them, I am sent you. It's fun to put other names with him, and some of them I don't mind, God the Creator, God the Sustainer, God the Almighty, etc., etc., etc. Some of those are biblical, but sometimes we go a little too far. And again, God is not your buddy or pal, God's God. And we should respect him as such. So how do you do that? Becomes the question, right? I've told you how to keep his name sacred and how you're supposed to respect him and hold him and all, but I haven't told you yet how. Besides taking your sandals off. It's the way you live. When I was in a uniform, when I did that other job, I knew that I had to respect when they followed my, I don't want to say orders, that's such an ugly word, my suggestions. When that uniform became the authority that they listened to, when that uniform became the giver of peace in the midst of chaos, when that uniform commanded their life to change, and they did, then I knew that they respected that uniform and who was in it, right? It's the same thing with God. God has commanded you how to live, has he not? God has told you how to change your life. God gave you 10 basic commands, and the very first 4 are all about respecting him, are they not? The way you live, the way you change your life, shows God whether or not you hold him in respect and awe and sacred. Guess what? If you're not helping the less fortunate, you're dishonoring God. If you're giving God a last name that has something to do with holding back water, you're dishonoring God. If you're not studying the scriptures and trying to understand God more, you're dishonoring God. If you can't go through life without anger, you're dishonoring God. If you're not helping one another, you're dishonoring God. If you're not holding your family together through love and kindness and compassion, you're withholding God. And I'm sorry, Chelsea, if more sarcasm comes out of my mouth than love and compassion, then I'm dishonoring God. I say that because I always pick on Chelsea. The way you live shows whether or not you hold God sacred. There's a story that I read that to me really drives this point home, and it's not in the Bible. In Copenhagen, Denmark, there's a big cathedral that in the 1700s the Pope commissioned, and if I had my notes, I'd give you the guy's name, for this artist to put a bunch of statues in. This is not the statue, I don't believe. One of the statues, as you walk into the church, is of the resurrected Christ. In a Catholic church, you have a low Copenhagen sculptor Albert Bertel Thorvaldsen. I knew you guys couldn't live without that information, so I didn't want you calling me in the middle of the night to get it. But there's a statue, and in the Catholic Church you have 2 altars. You have a lower altar and you have the high altar. This statue is above the high altar. And you can go to the low altar and you can look up. You can't see the face on the statue. It's not until you drop to your knees and look up, that you can tell it's the glory of God shown in the face of his Son, Jesus Christ. You have to be reverent and, as we would say in my other job, assume the position before you're drawn to God. That's the way we need to be each and every day of our lives. We need to be in awe. We need to show reverence. And we need to hold God sacred and holy. Amen. Amen.